Out of all the games being released in the year 2023, I was surprised to see Xenonauts 2 make that list. To sum it up, Xenonauts 1 was ultimately a callback to the classic XCOM games of the 90s. While it did have some strong points, it suffered from numerous late game bugs, strange performance issues, and some questionable design decisions. Still, I was very curious to see what a sequel would have brought to the table. 9 years from the first game's release brings us the early access version of the sequel. Is it a step up from the first, or does it fail to expand on the foundations laid by its predecessor? And before we begin, I did receive a free code from the publisher Hooded Horse. While I do appreciate the free code, it will not deter me from a fair and honest review. Sounds good? Let's begin. So when starting up the game, you can choose your difficulty and whether or not you want to begin the tutorial. The tutorial itself is pretty good explaining the turn-based combat mechanics of the game, however it fails to explain much on base management. I assume that the tutorial will be expanded on the future to cover base management and more on the geoscope gameplay. And after the tutorial, you can place your first base on where you would like the base to be located. And for me, I chose my first base within Asia, but as close as I can get within Europe, Africa, and the Soviet Union. Eventually, I did put an additional base in Latin America to cover the Americas. And if you've played the original or have played the original XCOM titles, you'll feel right at home with how base construction works. Basically, you place facilities within a grid, you hire and equip your soldiers, you choose your research, your production tasks, etc., etc. Most of what is here is carried over from the first game, so most of your resources should go to research in order to get some advantage on the aliens. Overall, it's a tried and true system that goes back to the 90s, but it's still fun to play with. And eventually, just like other XCOM titles and the prior game, a UFO will appear within your radar and you can send the interceptors to take down the flying object. You can play the battles manually, but the system is pretty rough at this stage, and the game even recommends to just stick with the auto-resolve, which I did for a majority of my battles. One issue I have noticed is how it takes days for your interceptors to get rearmed as well as to get repaired, and this should be accelerated going forward, or at least offer the player a way to adjust the repair speed. I've noticed that a ton of UFOs just appear all at once, meaning there's just a lot of dead time either waiting for your ships to be repaired or waiting for the UFOs to appear. It was an issue that the first game had as well and should be looked into more to avoid this shotgun approach. And after taking down a UFO, you can equip your troops and send them to the crash site. Alternatively, you can also have the local forces salvage the UFO for a cash bonus, but you will miss out on the valuable loot and research potential. As expected, the combat is turn-based using the old school method of time units instead of the modern method of one move and one action, and depending on the weapon chosen, the skill of the unit, and the location on where both the enemy and the squad mate is will determine how accurate the shot will be. And from here, I noticed that both the assault cannon and the sniper are two of the best weapon types in the game by far. For the assault cannon, you can shoot 10 bullets at once, while the sniper has a deadly accuracy from afar, which is to be expected for that kind of weapon. And shotguns are also really good for close quarter encounters, but involves someone with a much more maneuverability to pull it off and just more time units in general. At first, the missions were challenging, especially with a lack of much armor and using conventional weapons, but unlocking better weapons, armor, leveling up troops made the future missions to be much easier. I would also recommend having at least one armored vehicle with you for additional firepower and the long range support. It's very invaluable and are pretty OP, honestly. And outside of the weapon imbalance that I have mentioned, there are also some notable flaws with the combat. For one, whether or not you hit an enemy is by pure chance as expected. I've missed on many high percentage shots while also somehow making a ton of low percentage shots with no issues. Many games do this, unfortunately, and try to hide the true percentage, so I'm assuming there's some hidden math going on in the background. XCOM 2 especially was notorious for this not being 100% accurate on the chance to hit, so I'm honestly not too surprised here. Another is just how simplistic and passive the AI can be. Even on missions where the aliens are the aggressor attacking a city, they are just too comfortable crouching behind somewhere and waiting for you to show up. And since the AI's actions are predicated by yours, it slows down the combat further as you inch slowly to make sure you have enough time units to blast away unexpected aliens. Friendly NPCs and especially civilians just run into the direction of aliens, making them easy targets for the enemies. Overall, the AI just needs to be improved from many angles. And for more similarities to XCOM 2, the sequel also features time missions, which are a bit of a mixed bag for me. One in particular involves saving a certain amount of citizens before being abducted. I'm fine with the concept of time missions, but it shouldn't be such a conflict compared to the turn-based combat system. So for how few turns you're given to complete these missions, it seems that you just need to rush out your shoulders just to complete the objective in time, causing massive casualties to be incurred. And honestly, it's just not a great long-term strategy because then you're going to have to replace all those soldiers and regain all of that experience. A better system would be to have more turns to complete the objective or ways to increase the turn time. So something like, if you disable a beacon or defeating a certain amount of the aliens, it'll give you an additional turn or so. And devs have stated that they are working to adjust the turn limit. It is in the works for a future update, so definitely there was some negative feedback from the community regarding this. So I'm glad to see that the developers are quickly making the adjustment. Assaulting alien bases are always my favorite missions, and this one is no exception. It forces the aliens to be on the defensive as you breach each room carefully, hoping not to walk into a death trap. Best to attack each room for all sides to minimize friendly casualties and to maximize the enemy casualties. Overall, these are very enjoyable and I always like them, although I only ran into one throughout my whole campaign. Along with base assault, base defense is also included here as well, and I found these to be incredibly easy to deal with, honestly. All your units start in one room and can be deployed freely before the battle commences. Basically what I did is I just stacked my troops against the doors and opened them to attack the aliens that were approaching. It only really becomes difficult if your base is undermanned and you can only protect one side, and then that forces your squad to be on the move, but that'll most likely be a rarity unless your main troops are flying to another or from another mission and the base gets attacked during that time. So after each mission, you are given a summary of how the team performed and if they received any medals or increase in rank. And it's always cool seeing how much better your troops become with each mission, as well as all the medals they can achieve for their service. And returning back to base will bring back a ton of new goods to research and play around with, which is always fun to find out what you'll end up with. Unfortunately, most of what you can research are carryovers from the first game, which I do understand from one point, but I am curious to see what else they have in store. After every 30 days, you'll get some of that cash money, boy, from the remaining continents, and if one of the regions reaches 100 panic, then you will lose out on any future support from them. If 2 countries reach 100 panic, then the game is over. I'm fine with this mechanic theoretically, but there's not enough you can do to lower it. I mean, sure, there are some special missions that do appear and help lower the amount globally, but those are a rarity. And even after completing every mission and saving every city that needed help, I still had over 90 panic for both North America and Latin America. There just doesn't seem to be a way to lower it outside of these select missions. For the graphics and presentation, what is here is fine. It should be noted that there is a ton of missing artwork and graphics for certain events and situations. Therefore, we really don't know how everything will look by the end. Although most of the models and battles should stay consistent, the music is fine, although there are only a handful of tracks to listen to, which naturally gets a bit repetitive over time. As this is an early access title, bugs and a lack of polish is to be expected. This mainly comes in the form of random hitching as your characters move across the screen when an enemy UFO appears, etc, etc, and loading times are just abysmal at this stage, especially for a game like this if you plan to reload earlier saves or restart a mission. There's also just a lack of content after 18 hours of game time. I basically did all I can, and all this is understandable for being in early access, but this is a problem when the price tag is $40, which is just way too high for the amount of content you get here. So I gotta say, Overall, I gotta give it a soft pass, and I would just say to wait for more updates and for a sale down the road. Xenonauts 2 had a solid foundation here, but most of what is here is borrowed from the first game, and the game, like I said, is being sold for $40 full price, which is just not worth it in my opinion. It also lacks a ton of polish at the moment, and right now I can easily recommend the two Firaxis XCOM titles over this one at the moment easily. And for a more complete game that harkens back to a more old school gameplay, I would say feel free to look at the first title, which is being sold at $25 at full price, but goes on sale for much less than that. As always, thank you guys for watching, and this is Powerhouse signing off.